Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday, the 26th of November 2024. Today we are talking to the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, often described as OFSI, which is responsible for implementing, as it says, financial sanctions. And obviously has become a particularly important issue since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but has been in existence for some years before that. So I'm delighted to welcome today Giles Thomson, who's the Director for the Economic Crime and Sanctions at the Treasury. He's joined by Beth Davies, who's the Deputy Director for the Office for OFSI at HM Treasury, and based in Darlington. I think if you're a woman called Beth, you seem to need to be based in Darlington. In joke, sorry for anyone watching for the committee. And Chris Watts also joins them, who's the Deputy Director for the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. Now, we do have a bit of a rule in this committee to spell out acronyms. We may, on this occasion, slightly shift into OFSI just for save our tongue twisting. So before we go into the main session, Mr. Thomas, I just wanted to note that we were informed that the FCDO last week sanctioned three, the press release described them as notorious kleptocrats, and that the Foreign Secretary is going to be working closely with his cabinet counterparts to deliver a government-wide agenda to tackle the impacts of corruption and illicit finance, both at home and overseas. Now, this is very much in your bag. What's the impact? What was your role in this action against these three individuals?
Yeah, so in a scenario like that, we'll work with the Foreign Office in the run-up to the announcement to understand the intention behind the sanctions, the targets they're envisaging, and particularly for us, what will be important is understanding their UK nexus, so their links to the UK. What assets might the targets possess in the UK that would need to be frozen in the event of the designation going ahead? And we then very much will get involved subsequent to the announcement from basics like ensuring that the consolidated list of designated persons that we maintain is updated rapidly, ensuring that all our relevant guidance and other products take account of these new designations, and then also ensuring that assets that they possess in the UK are frozen and reported to OFSI by private sector actors. And we are then, particularly with these designations, likely to receive licence applications under various grounds in relation to anyone resident in the UK or assets that they will possess in the UK that would need upkeep. And obviously enforcement action, further down the line, should there be any breaches in relation to these particular designated persons.
Okay, thank you. And of course you were set up in 2016 and lots has changed since then. You had to take on new challenges. Could you perhaps outline, we're a new committee, what you were set up to do, what your purpose was, what your powers are, and what's changed since the Russian invasion?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, as you say, OFSI was set up in 2016 with the intention of ensuring, on the one hand, that we provided a better service to the public and the private sector to help them implement sanctions and understand sanctions. And also to ensure that they were properly enforced in the UK. And that was a desire to make the sanctions work more effectively as a foreign and security policy tool, and to ensure that the financial system in the UK was protected as far as possible. So we started off back in 2016 and grew up until around 40-odd people working in OFSI on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That substantially increased as our workload changed exponentially in quantity and quality on the back of the Russia sanctions regime, and we are now got around 150 members of staff in OFSI. Our primary powers, responsibilities relate to as it says in the name, the implementation and enforcement of sanctions, but that's conducting guidance, outreach, engagement with industry, NGOs, international partners and others to explain sanctions and ensure that they're well understood and implemented. And then it also extends to licensing, which is a major function of OFSI, to ensure that where there are valid grounds within the legislation, people can access, be it basic needs or there are humanitarian provisions in place. And then also the enforcement side for financial sanctions breaches, and ensuring that where we detect and see breaches, we are able to take proportionate action against those. And so now, our operations very much based around those functions with the 150 odd people that we've got. I would say within that we also have responsibility within OFSI for domestic counter-terrorism designations. So they're the only bits of designations in the UK system that OFSI will actually be responsible for the designation decisions. Treasury ministers will take those where the target is a UK, has got a significant nexus to the UK. And we've also got a newly established intelligence unit within OFSI, which we set up on the back of the Russian invasion to really support all our work and ensure that we're piecing together the intelligence picture, the threats, the vulnerabilities, better using our data to fulfil all our functions.
Okay, and you obviously we'll touch a bit more later about the work you would do with other departments, but you mentioned there about Treasury ministers making this decision. But when you're advising ministers generally across government, what's your interaction with ministers in terms of pushing advice up to ministers to make decisions? And can you just be clear to the committee which ministers make decisions on which issues, which departments? Yeah,
no, absolutely. So with the exception of the domestic counter-terrorism regime, which using the acronyms we call CT3, it's Foreign Office ministers who will make the decisions on designations. So under whatever regime, the Foreign Office minister will take the decision. Where there's a significant Treasury interest, so it's a significant financial sanction that is going to impact the financial sector, impact the economy, and this will be one of my other teams, not the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementations, but a separate policy team that is also within my bit of the Treasury, would work with the Foreign Office and would put advice to Treasury ministers where necessary on those measures, but responsibility sits with the Foreign Office. Then enforcement, implementation, licensing, which is in OFSI's core remit. Licensing decisions, we have a delegation framework, which is public now, which sets out what decisions will routinely go to Treasury ministers. They tend to be the most sort of high-profile, contentious, difficult decisions on licensing requests would go to a Treasury minister. Otherwise, those are delegated to Chris primarily day-to-day, as well as members of his team. And then, enforcement actions we are done. I take the decision on monetary penalties and other enforcement actions in order to keep that.
When you say you make the decision on monetary penalties, you set the level of monetary penalty?
Yes, so on advice from my team, they will put a recommendation to me on whether we should enforce a monetary penalty, and if so, what the proportionate right amount would be.
And you also, Beth Davies and Chris Watts are designated only to working for the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. Mr. Thomson, you have a wider role in the Treasury, and you mentioned then that you have another team working to you. Can you just be clear what your other responsibilities are and how much of your time is spent dealing with the sanctions regime?
Yeah, no. So the other part of my group covers financial sanctions policy. That's sort of working on the design of financial sanctions measures, working very closely with the Foreign Office, and one of the things they've also been working on is the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Scheme, on which there was a second reading in Parliament last week. And then we also have responsibility for the Treasury's work on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing policy, so ownership of the money laundering regulations, the supervisory system in the UK for AML, CTF, and our international representation at the Financial Action Task Force. I can't put an exact percentage on time. So what I would say is that, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the sanctions and the OFSI work has taken up a substantial proportion of my time and focus, as has been required.
Okay, but you're at the hub of a lot of the policy making?
Yes.
Okay, and we'll come into that a bit more. And one of the recently bit of advice you published was to companies warning them about paying North Korean IT workers who could be diverting funds to the North Korean regime. That's not normally what we would be thinking about when we look at sanctions. What alerted you to that, and what made you take that
That was, and I think the origin of that was out of work that we do with a grouping called the G7 Plus on DPRK, on North Korea, who get together periodically to discuss ways to better implement sanctions on DPRK as well as potentially new sanctions. And
DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is that?
Yes, exactly. So sorry.
So just say so let's stick with North Korea, I think. Then
North Korea, okay. That was part of a coordinated set of these advisories that various G7 Plus countries put out, and one where we detected in the UK that this was a typology being used to provide foreign currency to North Korea.
So when you do that, what advice are you able to give a company to be able to winkle out that somebody is trying to do this? I mean, what's involved and what interaction do you have with those companies when you're trying to help them comply?
Yeah.
Mr. Watts.
Thanks. So essentially, we were looking in that scenario at the concept of people working remotely, but trying to identify as being from countries which were not North Korea. So we were able to identify typical things that you might see in their interview process or in their working pattern, which might give rise to suspicion. I don't have all of those to hand, but so we gave essentially tips on spotting this and just alerted people to that methodology.
And do you think other foreign powers could be doing the same thing? Is there a likelihood that this is not just North Korea?
It's certainly a possibility. It's not one that's come up through the intelligence or the working with partners as yet.
Okay. Right. Well, just when we were talking about making, you're quite at the hub, Mr. Thomson, of making policy here. But you have got different departments, which we'll go on to some of the other departments, Department of Business and Foreign Office in more detail later. But are there areas where you think it's challenging that you're having to work across departments? Were there areas where perhaps things could fall through the cracks? I mean, you've been going now for 8 years, and you've had intense activity in the last 2. In your professional opinion, are there areas that could be tightened, improved in the work that you do, and particularly around the policy advice?
Yeah, so I mean, I think on the policy advice, my view would be that actually, I would like to think that's worked pretty effectively over the last few years with the Foreign Office in relation to the Russia sanctions regime, which has been the primary cause for it. The relationship has been incredibly close. We work day to day, I think, very effectively with our Foreign Office counterparts. I think what we have been looking at across government, in particular over the last 2 or 3 years, is the implementation enforcement side of the government picture, and that led, for instance, to the creation of the Office of Trade Sanctions implementation, because there was a feeling that there was a gap in the architecture there in relation to trade in services in particular. We also have benefited in OFSI as well as in different parts of government from the Economic Deterrence Initiative, the EDI funding, which was a pot of funding across government to help improve implementation and enforcement. And that's given us the capability to start some projects to help us join up a little bit better, like exploring whether we could have a common sanctions website portal rather than people having to go to all different places for different information. Could in the future we move to one system for submitting license applications to OTSI, Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation, and OFSI to make the customer experience better. So, and there's further work going on now that Foreign Office ministers have announced to make sure we continue to improve that cross-government system.
So in that cross-government approach, who would you say is the lead department? Is that you, or the lead individual? Is that you, or is that others?
No, I mean, I would very much see the Foreign Office.
It's an opportunity for the Treasury to take
yes, exactly.
Take care of everything.
No, very uncharacteristically, I won't. No, I think the Foreign Office is very much the central hub for sanctions. They are the primary department. They set the overall strategy. They take the decisions on the designations, and we work within them. On the implementation enforcement side, I'd like to think OFSI is one of the primary partners there, but we work very closely with Trade Sanctions Implementation Office, but also key relationships for us are with the National Crime Agency, who are responsible for criminal enforcement of financial sanctions breaches, and we do a lot of work with on the intelligence space as well as the Financial Conduct Authority, who you'll be very familiar with.
It's quite a complex landscape. But I raised at the top the recent action against 3 particular cracks, but do you think that most of the sanctions work is people who are making mistakes inadvertently or actually criminal?
In terms of the work that we will do day to day. And so I think cases where we see real, knowledge, willful intent to circumvent, evade, breach our financial sanctions would typically, when we look at that from an enforcement lens, cross the threshold for potential criminal investigation and prosecution, and we would refer those cases to the National Crime Agency. I think primarily, the cases that we're looking at within OFSI from an enforcement perspective tend to be, they sort of range from cases that we're likely to take no further action against, of, either they weren't breaches but people have reported to them us out of an abundance of caution, or they were very minor breaches, where people had either made genuine mistakes or, they had good systems in place, but it was a very minor failing, or people who have, where we will impose a penalty, have shown, sort of gross or, negligence, ignorance when they should have known better, had systems that weren't fit for purpose, not been aware of the risks that they were running. And so they will primarily be in that sort of space, as you would have seen from the monetary penalties that we've issued to date. I would say, monetary penalties are very much the tip of the iceberg. They're the very small percentage of cases we see. I mean, the bulk of our efforts day in, day out go to helping, major banks, major insurance firms, accountancy, legal providers who all want to comply, to comply more effectively and give them the support in doing that, because that's actually going to be the most effective route to good implementation.
Okay. I see Beth Davies is nodding along there. I wonder if you could give us some specific examples of these lower level sanctions.
Sorry.
Well, of the ones that don't get to the criminality level.
Yeah, so we have a number of outcomes that we can determine when we get to the end of an enforcement outcome. And as Giles says, it may be that the breach is such that we decide that we will take no further action. We can also issue warning.
Can you give us an example of what that would, just to make it live for people, for all of us?
So we published our case factors that determine. So I don't speak to specific cases specifically.
I appreciate that.
So what we have set out is we look at the severity and we look at the value and we look at the conduct that's been. So we look at all those factors in the round. That's one of the reasons why financial investigations are complex, because you take all those things into account. But we're looking at the behaviours and whether there has been a pattern of activity. We're also looking at what the value of a breach has been. We've also considered whether or not the conduct that's also gone into play by the firms in question. So whether or not they've voluntarily disclosed information to us and voluntarily reported, or whether we found that out through another means. That also plays into the conduct that's surrounding the suspected breach or breach as well. And so that leads to, those are the things that we'd be taking in, and those would be called mitigating factors and things that we would judge perhaps not in the public interest to proceed to a penalty.
Have you got an idea of the percentage that you refer to the National Crime Agency?
I'm not sure that we would...
We haven't given public figures for a number of cases because the National Crime Agency, are very keen to preserve their the operational effectiveness of what they're doing and not prejudice any investigations that they're going on. So they've asked us to be
circumspect on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe we might have a private discussion about that if we need to. And do you think, in summary, are you preventing? Is your work implementing the sanctions preventing further sanctions from other bodies? Do you think it's having a preventative approach, or is it just about enforcing against the people making mistakes? Ms. Davies.
So I think we're very much looking to help firms comply with sanctions. We want to see sanctions implemented effectively. That's how they will be most effective. We work really closely with industry to understand what they need more from us. We published last week a further advisory on the oil price cap, which was identifying behaviours that we wanted industry to be alive to. And so we're really in that space of wanting industry to be as able to comply as possible, because we recognise that they're at the front line of implementing. And we know from the engagement we have with them that they take account of the guidance that we put out. They take account of the monetary penalties that we publish, the updates that we publish, the frequently asked questions that we put, the FAQs that we put out. So the feedback that we get is that industry wants to comply. They're keen to work with us to understand what their obligations are, and they are cautious and they are very interested in penalties when we apply them, and even disclosures when we apply them as well. So the reputation is really important to industry, and we really hear that from them when we're working with them.
We're going to delve into all this, of course, in more detail, starting with John Glenn MP.
Great. Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Thomson and Mr. Watts in particular for the support that you gave me when I was Economic Secretary up until July 2022. Can I just start by focusing on resources. We had many discussions back then about how small your team was. It seems to be that it's, from what you've said, it's gone to 150. It's sort of tripled in the last couple of years, understandably, given what's been happening. But could you tell us about your sense of, is that enough? I mean, obviously, there's a great comparison always made with what the US have, with OFAC, a much larger organisation. So could you tell us how you feel? This is your opportunity to get on the record how frustrated or not you are with the number of people you have working for you. And just, if I may, just supplementary to that, in terms of the distribution between enforcement, licensing and engagement, you've rightly set out that you're trying to give a lot of advice. But one of the frustrations, I think, out there, and you see it with people like Tom Keating and others, although I think in his evidence in February was much more guarded in terms of the trajectory you were on. But, are we being assertive enough in terms of going after people? So I just like your sense of, how well you're resourced and are you configured in the right way for what, we need you to do?
No, great, thank you. I'm not sure if it's an opportunity or a career-limiting minefield.
I think you can influence things significantly.
So, look, I mean, I do genuinely feel tremendously lucky in many ways to have got the level of resourcing and commitment that we have. As you know, given the fiscal constraints and the position and the size of the Treasury, that 150 people is a considerable number within the Treasury, and to have resources tripled has been a huge investment. And the budget document 2 or 3 weeks ago noted that, as part of the spending review phase 1 settlement, the Treasury is going to continue to resource the work that OFSI do. Would I like more resource? Yes, I don't think any government agency or department would say
you need
it. I think not to do the job that we think we can do and that we are set up to do. I think we can now do a lot to continue to improve the effectiveness of what those 150 people do. That's relatively new. I mean, it's taken us, over the 2 years since the invasion to get up to that number. A lot of people are relatively new. We've invested in new tools, capabilities that still need to properly reap benefit. So, I think my real focus now is trying to make the system as effective and efficient as possible. Yes, if we had more people, we could take on more enforcement cases, and that's the same for any police force, any national crime agency, any regulator. But the challenge is to prioritise cases rigorously and do the most high impact, most effective work we can. I think on the question of comparators, that's an interesting one in that, I don't have a precise figure for OFAC in the US, who are very much the gold standard. But, actually, if you compare size of sanctions regime, size of economy, I don't think we actually now compare unfavourably with OFAC in size, although a much younger organisation, still very much on a journey. And then if you compare us to other jurisdictions around the world, I mean, I always feel tremendously lucky when I go and sit with a number of counterparts across different countries who will have teams far fewer than we do, doing equivalent roles in pretty much every other jurisdiction around the world. In terms of the split, I'm not able to give you precise numbers, but what I would say is that our casework teams, the licensing and enforcement functions, represent the majority of they're the biggest units in OFSI, and they're the ones that have grown most significantly, in line with the huge increase in licence applications we got, in line with our desire to do more enforcement cases, as well as the large increase in the number of reports given to us on enforcement. But we have also, I think we've about doubled our engagement team to try and get out there and engage more internationally and domestically, as well as setting up this new intelligence unit function, which was an entirely new unit that we set up.
Can I just ask you about the nature of these secondees that you have in from the FCA and other, probably NCA as well, I don't know. But how does that work? And, I mean, I think the sense that some people have is that the Foreign Office, broadly, as we know, makes the fundamental designation decisions with advice from the Treasury about how that should or shouldn't work in implementation terms. But there isn't enough sort of heft behind going out and actually apprehending pretty sophisticated, highly lawyered up individuals who are doing everything they can through subsidiaries, different jurisdictions, to hide from the effect of these sanctions. And do you recognise that anxiety, and how would you say Ofsted is meeting that, despite the headline numbers you can give us about the number of banks, number of designated individuals? Yeah. There's still this sense that there's lots seeping through the cracks. Do you need any? How can we see your enterprise enriched so that it has what it needs to really go after those that are seeping through the cracks?
Yeah. So on the question of secondees, we've two sets of secondees that I would say we've had initially during the first year or two after the invasion of Ukraine. We brought in a good number of people very quickly on secondment from the Financial Conduct Authority, the National Crime Agency, HM Revenue and Customs, because we needed to upscale very quickly, and they had more experience in these areas. So we benefited from someone coming in from the Financial Conduct Authority's Enforcement Division, for instance, who spent some time with us, imparted a lot of very useful knowledge. We had people coming in from Revenue and Customs on the intelligence and other areas. And by and large, we've moved away from that sort of reliance on shorter-term secondments from other bits of the government system. And actually, we've got people within the intelligence unit, for instance, who come from HMRC and have moved over to us, bringing a wealth of experience of intelligence work from there. So we've tried to sort of mainstream that into our resourcing model. But we also have, we've had one, and we're about to get another secondee from OFAC into OFSI, which is a new innovation.
OFAC, just about.
Sorry, it's the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is broadly the US equivalent of OFSI.
It's not everyone watching. I'm sure we've got a vast audience.
And we work incredibly closely with them, and we've just sent the first member of OFSI out to the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the US Treasury. And that has been hugely valuable, enabling us to learn from OFAC, to exchange information, to improve information sharing. I think in terms of the question about what more can we do to really tackle the most sophisticated, difficult challenge. Firstly, I think everyone across the government system, be it the National Crime Agency or the Financial Conduct Authority, would recognise the inherent challenges of dealing with crime, wrongdoing that is global, piecing together the international picture that is highly sophisticated, where you're subject to high degrees of legal challenge. That is a problem that we see and that we're already experiencing on some of our licensing decisions in particular. I think on the enforcement side, these cases take a long time and a lot of effort to investigate. We've done our first post-Russia 2022 civil monetary penalty case a few months ago. There are a number more that are at relatively mature levels, and that we hope to be able to publish in the next few months. That I think will start to show the increasing ability of OFSI to tackle the more egregious end, the more sophisticated end of what's going wrong within the financial sanctions implementation system. And I think what we need to continue doing, I'd say it's giving us the tools and the equipment to continue to tackle that higher end of sanctions circumvention and evasion. And that's partly being able to continue to invest in staff, in having people who have got the right experience.
When you get the fines, it doesn't add to your organisation, does it? Right.
No.
So would that? That's unlikely to change. Do you think it should change in other jurisdictions? I understand that does happen.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the international comparators. And I've always had this come at the other end from when I've been working with the Home Office or other agencies who always,
as well,
as always come to the Treasury and say, why can't we keep our fine? The fines come into the overall government budget, into the consolidated fund, and then are allocated out through spending review choices. So ultimately it's the same pot of money that's being allocated out.
Can I just ask you one further question, if I may, Chair, and building on what the Chair said, which is on this issue of who makes what decisions. Now, you will recall that I, as the Economic Secretary, was involved in quite a complicated case dealing with an appeal from a large bank. I felt that was quite a responsibility. I remember seeing 3 massive lever arch files, and I was sat there thinking, gosh, am I a judge, or what am I trying to do? I think after that we reviewed it and looked at the whole issue of how you should delegate to officials and so on. Would you like to explain to the committee where those lines are drawn now, and how there is ministerial accountability for decision making, but when decisions are delegated, because obviously that would be a concern. I mean, I felt that the legislation when it was written was unrealistic in giving ministers such exposure to such complexity in that way. But perhaps you could, for the clarity and purposes of what we're trying to achieve here, tell us where we are now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So maybe if I start with the enforcement framework, and then Chris can explain where we are on licensing, because that's an important part, as you know, of the ministerial decision-making in the Treasury. On enforcement, I think the approach that we've got was designed to, protect, if you like, ministers from the complexity of some of these cases, but also, keeping this as an independent regulatory function. It's where you're potentially going to impose a fine on a major UK bank or other firm. There's always going to be lobbying conversations wanting to happen, and it felt right to us to distance ministers from that, and to have as it is in Revenue and Customs, Financial Conduct Authority, elsewhere, an independent decision. But we also wanted to create a framework for challenge review that didn't require people to go straight away to the court system, although that remains the ultimate recourse. So this is where the ministerial review came from, I think, and I forget the exact timings, whether you were still in post at the time, but we learned a lot from those first few cases and reflected on that, and have now moved to a system whereby people who disagree with and want to challenge our decision to impose a penalty can request a review of the minister, an administrative review, but the minister has the ability to delegate that to a senior official, and so that would be someone of my equivalent rank within the Treasury, but from a different part of the Treasury, who would independently review that. And so when we get a challenge, a request for a review, we will put that to the minister with a recommendation as to whether they might want to delegate or not that case, and they will decide whether they want to delegate it or not. It's something we're also keeping under review about whether we want to change that system further in the future.
Would it require any legislative change?
It would require legislative change.
For primary legislation, or?
I would need to confirm whether it's primary.
Okay, if you could write, just because that just would be helpful to know,
yes.
Because it's quite a big difference if it's primary and secondary.
I've had enough time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms Lynn. Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to dig a bit more into the cross-departmental cooperation piece, and in particular with the FCDO, and if you could explain in a bit more detail what that relationship's like. Specifically, is it kind of top-down where the instruction comes and you work out how to implement, or is it very much that you provide recommendations and then they sign them off, or is it a more equal partnership? Can you just describe how that relationship looks like?
Yeah, so I'll describe it as very, very iterative and collaborative, in that we will get early sight from the Foreign Office of what their strategy is, and a lot of this is formed multilaterally with G7 partners, and I will be involved, or Beth or Chris will be involved in conversations with the Foreign Office, with senior US or EU counterparts. So we're very much will be involved, because the Foreign Office will have views about the overall strategy, but our role will be to work with them to say, well, from a Treasury perspective, we think that could be most impactful on Russia, but be careful of this economic impact, on the UK, or when it comes to implementation, enforcement, that would be easy, that would be challenging, and that works and has. I would say during the initial stages of the crisis, things were happening at such a pace, with such sort of ferocious volume and scale, that we were sometimes playing catch up, as I think every jurisdiction was. But as the pace has slowed down a little bit and we've embedded our new ways of working I think we have got much better at acting in unison, both internationally and domestically. I think we then, once the actual decision is made about who we're designating and how that fits with the overall strategy, there's a lot of OFSI input into that through the intelligence capabilities that we've got and what we've seen on our casework. If you're thinking of designating this person, have you thought about this? But then we aim to be ready to go with licensing and other guidance products, and subsequently, particularly on the licensing function, there will be a lot of close engagement between what Chris's teams will be doing there and the Foreign Office, because quite often a licensing decision will be about weighing up the sort of intent of the regime to sanction, put restrictions in place versus other public policy objectives, be it humanitarian, be it human rights, be it commercial interests or other interests. And so we will, although that's our decision, we will be consulting the Foreign Office on that.
So when you said you were playing catch up in the sort of heat of the crisis, does that mean sometimes decisions were being made and instructions were being given that you didn't feel were really implementable? Was it perhaps political decisions being made that you think actually if we had a more iterative conversation like you're having now, then those instructions wouldn't have come?
No, I wouldn't say it was a case of we were being given sort of political decisions that were unimplementable or unenforceable. I think it was the sheer sort of pace at which some of this was happening. Work was going on sometimes, overnight at the weekend. I mean, I think the Central Bank of Russia immobilization of assets was done over a weekend because, there was information suggesting that these assets would move if we didn't act quickly. And in scenarios like that, it's very difficult to preempt every possible consequence of that. So, there were a number of occasions where, Beth hadn't joined us at the time, but Chris or I would get, phoned up by UK Finance or a major bank saying, oh God, this new restriction, we've got, a transaction that's been caught by it, or this is a major problem. And, due to the time pressure, we hadn't always been able to anticipate that ahead of the game. And we responded, I like to think, as quickly and rapidly to put in place, be it a general licence or some other mitigation to address what we call unintended consequences. And I think we've now got a lot better at actually, what the gold standard is that when we announce a designation, we, as far as possible, have anticipated potential knock-on impact on British business or other areas that we want to mitigate, and we've put in place a licence, a general licence, or a frequently asked question or guidance which is very clear to industry so they know how to respond. But it was just the pace at which things are happening. You could spend months researching the economic financial impact of some of the measures we did, and we had hours to do it, and so we couldn't always anticipate everything preemptively.
Final question for me before I pass over. The sanctions list specifically, how much of that is driven by your intelligence versus what the Foreign Office wants to do?
I think it would depend on the regime, because I think the particular value added we can add to designation targets is from what we see through our licensing, enforcement, compliance casework, which is based on UK companies, people operating in the UK. So, there will be some regimes around the world where there's very little UK nexus, as we call it. Actually, the sanctions targets don't reside in the UK. They haven't really got assets in the UK or significant. And, the sanctions are more being used in those scenarios in a sort of demonstrate type purpose to demonstrate, disapproval of what's going on. We can add very little to that because we just don't see. There's not assets in the UK, we're not seeing licences, we're not seeing breach reports. Where there are domestic assets, domestic UK nationals, we're likely to have more intelligence and more input into that. So I would say the Russia regime is where the bulk of our efforts can be, but there are other regimes as well where we can add value. Yeah, Chris. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Watts. Because you're leading mostly on the Russian stuff. Was that
on the licensing particularly? Yeah. I was just going to say that one of the things that we've become a bit wiser to over the last 2.5 years has just been disruption of various kinds as well as enforcement and the effect of that. And so one of the things that we do occasionally, exactly as Giles describes, on the basis of what we're seeing in the information that's coming through OFSI and to OFSI, is to identify possible additional targets for designation, so that process of designation, sanctioning, it becomes, if you like, a quasi-enforcement tool in itself. So there are items of information we're seeing which can inform those future designations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Rachel Blake MP.
Good morning. Can you share with us what the impact of the launch of the Office for Trade Sanctions implementation has been?
Yes, I mean, I'll start and then I might pass to Beth, if that's okay, who works closely with them more regularly. But I mean, obviously, I can't speak directly to their work, but you know, from what we have seen, it has been a really useful additional part of the landscape, the architecture of sanctions implementation and enforcement, because you know, unlike in the US with the Office for Foreign Assets Control, whose remit extends to sanctions implementation and enforcement of the trade in services. This is things like auditing services, legal services, accountancy services, so IT services. So within the US system, that's all done by OFAC. Obviously doesn't have responsibility for those, and so we were getting a lot of business saying to us, well, how do we implement these new sanctions, which are quite novel sanctions on the trade in services? And so that's where OTSI, the Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation, has come in and helped to fill that gap in the system. And my impression, although they will be the best people to speak to about that, is that that's met quite a valuable need and demand from business and from industry. And we hope to be able to work increasingly closely with them to coordinate what we're doing, because financial sanctions and trade sanctions are often sort of very linked. But I mean, I might, if it's okay, pass to Ms. Davies.
Yeah, sure. So we've worked really closely with the Department for Business and Trade that was establishing what we call OTSI now and so they were looking at the OFSI model in terms of how the organisation was first set up. So they were looking at our powers and our tools and borrowing from them in their establishment and the way that they have set up. And now we work really closely with them. We recognise that we've got some shared stakeholders. So I do, and my teams do quite a lot of joint engagement, we look to work with stakeholders and make sure that we are giving both pieces of the puzzle for the stakeholders, so that they understand what we're looking for, and we're sharing guidance and working really closely with them. And the reception, as Giles has said, has been really positive so far. Obviously, they've only recently gone live. But exactly that, we've worked really closely to make sure that the messages that we're giving to stakeholders are aligned.
Thank you.
So in terms of the response from companies that need to work with both yourselves and the Office for Trade Sanctions Implementation, has there been a response from them about having to work with at least two different entities?
So I think that generally speaking, whilst there are shared stakeholders, they're looking for different things from us, and we've been really clear about where our remits lie and what licences OFSI will issue versus what licences would be available for trade services through OTSI. So I think that because we've been working so closely and we've made so much effort to make it clear who you need to go to, I think actually that has been noted, and it's certainly not something that has been escalated to me as a concern at this point. I think that we've worked really closely with them in making sure that the messages that are coming out, and that and we had a sanctions implementation group that we first started with businesses when the Russia crisis first established, and bringing together representations from business but also from other government departments. We've morphed that into a joint shared engagement forum now. So both foreign FCDO and OTSI and OFSI will lead that with the FCA and stakeholders. So that's a way of bringing everyone together.
Just on investigation capacity, is there a shared approach on investigation? Because clearly you're working with a lot of the same companies on one side around licensing, but also presumably interested in a lot of the same individuals around investigation and enforcement. So what kind of shared capacity and information sharing arrangements do you have?
We have information sharing arrangements with OTSI, but generally speaking, our investigations are separate. I would say, so we share information with that, and there's clearly established channels for doing that, and the investigation enforcement processes that OTSI have started are modelled on ours, so their powers and their processes look very similar to ours, and we've shared the ways that we work and the processes that we put in place for our enforcement caseworkers. We share those so that OTSI model looks very similar.
Are there any risks then in terms of not being aware of actions of individuals between the two of you?
I would say that that's not been something that we've felt is a risk at the moment. We do work really closely. There are a number of forums at my level with my opposite numbers in OTSI and in other and HMRC and others that meet really regularly. So there are lots of forums, and I genuinely speak to my opposite number in OTSI almost weekly. So there is quite a lot of shared information going.
Thank you very much.
And can I just ask, in terms of how, on the company side and licensing, is there any value of there being one point of contact?
Mr. Watson.
So it's a very similar situation in that OTSI has modelled its licensing practice on OFCs. We don't see a huge disadvantage at the moment in having two parallel streams. I think what we can see, and Giles talked earlier about the ideas around a portal, is trying to bring as much of that common sanctions service together at the point of delivery. I think we're all interested in working on that and have an open mind as to how far that might go.
Okay.
John Glenn, MB.
Yeah, can I just turn to the issue of Russia and the implementation of sanctions on Russia? Because if we look at the annual review for 22-23, I think it says that there have been penalties of 45,000. That doesn't seem very much when you think about the sort of intent at a sort of political level in terms of what the public's expectations were. And I just wondered how you characterise that, because I totally understand, obviously, having worked closely with your advice, that there is a lot of advice given to how to avoid the sanctions, companies not to avoid, but to work the right side of them. But probably the public's view is that, I would think, that this doesn't seem very significant in terms of penalties. And are we in the right place when it comes to that? And why is that? Because I think if people could understand why that number is so low, and I recognise that was in 22-23, but the problem we're left with is we've got this 150 professionals working in the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, and that's all the fines that are actually generated. Why is that? When we've got all these civil society organisations saying, we're the worst in the world, we've got all these oligarchs living here with complete impunity. Can you sort of unpack us how you see that? Because I think that would be really helpful to understand, how you see your role against that narrative.
Yeah, no, I'll start if that's okay.
Sorry.
I think, overall, you heard a lot of evidence previously, or the previous committee heard a lot of evidence about overall impact effectiveness of Russia sanctions. And, from our perspective, we do feel that they are working and having a significant impact. But, in terms of, more directly what we do on the enforcement front, a couple of points before directly going on to what we have done and what we hope to do in the future. Firstly, as Chris mentioned a few minutes ago, the totality of what we're doing on enforcement isn't the penalties. So as well as all the actions to help people comply, there is a lot that we do that, we don't think the best or the most likely outcome with a success is to pursue a monetary penalty case, but we can use the information we've got to feed into a designation, for instance, or potentially pass it to one of our operational partners to use some of their tools.
Behaviours shift even if fines aren't levied.
Well, exactly. If you end up designating an additional target, that can actually prevent the assets fleeing the UK or protect them from accessing the UK financial system. We can also pass stuff on for National Crime Agency have got criminal prosecutions, but they've got a number of other disruptive tools that they can use. We can pass information through the new information sharing public-private cell we've got with the major banks. We can pass information to them that will help them fine-tune their compliance systems to detect and prevent bad actors accessing the system. So, and then in terms of what we've done on the enforcement side, I think since in relation to the sanctions imposed post-invasion, we have issued a public disclosure in relation to Wise a year or so ago, and then we've issued a monetary penalty on a company called ICSL, Integrated Concierge Service Limited, for a relatively small amount. I mean, what I would say with that one is one of the reasons that was prioritised is that it came from what we call a proactive source. So one of the criticisms the previous committee heard is that, Office spends its entire time going after the people who voluntarily disclose rather than the real bad actors. Well, this case was actually one where they didn't disclose to us. We identified it through our own information sources, went out to them, got information from them, and pursued a penalty. So small amount, but we felt an important signal that actually we are now developing the capability within Office to target those people who aren't voluntarily reporting to us, where you're more likely to have the real sort of bad actors in the system. These, if you look at both our international comparators and our domestic comparators, Financial Conduct Authority, Office of Foreign Assets Control, other comparators, the length of time from a case being recorded for a penalty, an enforcement action to an actual public outcome, is sort of 2.5-3 years on average. I think our average within Office at the moment, from case being recorded to the monetary penalties we've issued, is around 27 months. So if you look at the time frame, since the sanctions came into place, it's always going to take you a few weeks or months subsequent to that to have the case reported to you or uncover it and then investigate. You should expect to see further numbers of cases of both wider range and higher value, in the coming months. And we hope to be able to demonstrate the increasing breadth and depth of what we're doing on that.
Can I just ask one small supplementary? I'm going to pass over to my colleague. Do you feel, though, that trajectory of time, it seems a large amount of time. Public want to sort of see things happen, and, as a minister, one was always facing that tension. Is there anything that could be done, any powers that you don't have that you think would help you to speed that process up and get to, fines more quickly to more individuals, that you feel through what you observe that you haven't got, your hands are tied?
Yeah. So I think that a lot of this is the time it takes to build the case, as well as the due process that's factored into it. And obviously in the due process, we discussed the ministerial review element earlier. Yeah. I think one thing we have since the Russian invasion, the Economic Crime Act gave us strict liability as a basis for sanctions breaches, which is certainly helpful. One thing we are looking at is there more we can do to speed these things up. We noted with interest the Financial Conduct Authority's recent fine on Starling Bank in relation, which I think they said very clearly in the press release was 14 months as a sort of start of their effort. So we're looking very closely at that, what we can learn from that. Whether we're also looking very closely at models that HMRC have got here, Revenue and Customs here, as well as in other countries for settlement approaches, whereby actually you could potentially move to a world where there's more negotiation with the company to try and reach an upfront settlement that might short-circuit the process. We're very interested in looking at that, whether our current level of penalties is sufficiently dissuasive and a full toolkit. So, that work is underway based on our experience of the caseload we've had to date.
So you think there could be more?
I'm sure there could be more improvements that we could.
Can I pass over to my colleague?
Just going to come in.
Quick follow-up on John Glennon's question. On the fines penalties point, have you looked at comparators, say the US, for example, flex to GDP, in terms of what are the level of fines they are doing versus what you are, or EU countries, and are you broadly in line, or is that even a valid comparison?
Yeah, I would say it's difficult to make comparisons because sanctions implementation and enforcement is to date, pre-Russia has been a relatively niche field, to be frank. I mean, the US, not just the Office of Foreign Assets Control, but the US regulatory system plays a slightly different game in terms of size, level of fines, as you know. Our monetary penalty powers, I'd say, are sort of, from my experience, broadly comparable to what I hear from other G7 EU countries, and I haven't seen, particularly higher, larger, or indeed many fines from, on the civil side from other countries. So,
Okay, thank you very much. Yuan MP.
Thank you, Chair. My colleague John Glenn MP referred to this perception of a lack of action. There's obviously a lot of action that goes on within the office that the average reader or even viewer of the session might not know about. Mr. Thomson, I was wondering if you could describe how you make the decision whether to publicise breaches when they occur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'll when we're deciding what action to take, we'll look at the range that we've got. So, to give the broad categories, we might decide that we've been given notice of a potential breach, but actually when we've looked at the facts there isn't a breach, so we would close that case. We might send a formal warning letter to a company, so that would be a private warning letter. That would be, in our published guidance we talk about cases that have got, we've talked about having moderate severity, lower severity, and then the most serious cases. If a case is lower severity, we would traditionally write a private warning letter to that company, engage with them, seek to improve their compliance processes, because we feel that public action would be disproportionate, both in terms of the impact on them, but also that there's not huge, significant, wider learning and impact we can have on other companies. Where a case moves into the moderate severity, that is what we would, under our new framework, consider for public disclosure. And I think there we're particularly looking at a case where there are some significant risks or factors in it. The behaviour could be quite negligent or quite ignorant of obligations. There could have been sort of major failings in a compliance system, or failure to evaluate, where we feel that it's sufficient that both a public disclosure is proportionate in relation to the company concern, but also that actually this can bring real value to the function we perform in terms of the lessons that industry as a whole will take from that. And then I think people read the penalty notices most closely, and in those, and obviously they have the biggest reputational hit on the companies involved, so those would be our what we classify as the serious cases, where we feel that the failings, the breach was really the most sort of aggravating circumstances.
What are the annual numbers for kind of moderate or severe breaches that you do investigate, and then also the breaches that don't go to that investigation level?
Yeah, so I think we have our caseload at the moment is approximately 400 odd cases that we have currently open, under consideration. I think in our last annual review, I think we noted that we issued 17 warning letters. We haven't published the annual review for this year, but that figure is going to be broadly similar when that annual review comes out. So the vast majority of cases will result in no further action. A sort of smaller subset will result in private engagement with the firm concerned, a warning letter, and then it's very much the sort of single figure percentages that will result in either a disclosure or a monetary penalty. I would say from what I've seen, that ratio is broadly comparable with foreign and domestic counterparts in terms of their caseloads. You want to have a deterrent for the toughest actions, but it's going to be the minority of your cases.
Yeah. Does that mean that given that you're investigating the majority of cases don't then go on to enforcement, does that come from being reported cases that are not severe enough, kind of an over-reporting, if you like? What do you think would be ways of reducing that ratio, if possible?
Yeah, so I think, firstly to say, that actually, although the bulk of our cases don't result in one of the more stringent outcomes, the bulk of our resource within OFSI is focused on those higher priority cases that are most likely to lead to a warning letter, a disclosure, or a monetary penalty. We try and sort of close cases as quickly as efficiently as possible to allocate resource to the highest risks. I mean, to some extent, we've encouraged self-disclosure, and we offer a discount against any fines we impose for voluntary self-disclosure, because we want to know, we want to see things, and we try and reassure business that we're not going to go out and hit people unnecessarily hard for moderate failings. But this actually really helps us build an intelligence picture of what's happening, where the vulnerabilities are, where the threats are, where compliance is strong, where compliance is weak. So, I think we're at the point where actually, more disclosures is good. It means that companies are aware of their obligations. What we don't want to see is sort of completely spurious disclosures. We prefer companies to err on the side of caution, but if something is clearly not a breach and it should be immediately obvious, that isn't a good use of their time. It's not a good use of our time. But I think like other agencies, we tend to err on the side of saying, if in doubt, disclose, because it's important that we have awareness, and the company will be risk averse, which in the current climate, we would recognise as sensible.
Would you say then that the majority of cases that don't go to further action are because the self-reporting or you've arrived at a case that is not severe enough and not important enough to warrant that, or is it a lack of tools to implement the further action?
I would say the majority, and Beth may want to add as well, the majority of cases that are closed or no further action is taken is because there's no identifiable breach, or if there is a breach, it seems so sort of marginal or questionable and with such sort of low value that it's not worth the investigative time to pursue that, when with finite resource we've got more substantial cases we could be taking on.
What would count as low value, to have a sense of that term?
It's difficult to put a figure on that because it would depend on the regime. We'll have had it, as Beth said earlier, we'll look at a number of different factors. Sorry, do you want to?
So we look at the severity, and we look at the value of the breach in question, and we look at the conduct around that as well. So those are the key things that we'll be determining. But we, as Giles was saying, we've invested in our analytical capability. So it's getting the amount of information that we do is really useful for us to identify whether there are patterns of behaviour, and we're looking at the public interest that can be served and what compliance messages we can use. So when we do make a disclosure or a monetary penalty, then there's public information that we're putting out. But we also then think about, we can also track some patterns that we're seeing. Maybe the value is particularly low, but we want to use that in terms of our messaging with our industry engagement that we do. So we also try and use the information in that purpose as well. But it is very much looking at, as Giles said, what's in the, where is our resource best targeted? And if we're considering, if a company is reporting on something that is relatively low level, and they've made that disclosure to us, and we've seen what mitigation they have subsequently put in place as a result of it, that we will all take into account under that conduct, and then thinking what action would be best served. As I said before, we really focus on a proportionate approach to our enforcement, and really working with industry to support their compliance. So we have that in mind at the whole time.
Thank you. I have one last question on the question of data reporting, which is previously, Mr. Thomson, you just earlier this morning you'd said that there was no publication of number of cases referred to crime enforcement because the NCA was not willing for you to make that publication. I was wondering if you could go into a bit more what they see as the risks of publication, even if it's an aggregate annual figure.
Traditionally, we and the NCA have been a bit worried about publishing details around our enforcement regimes, so that's on the criminal and the civil side, which might essentially give an advantage to those who want to game the system. So the concern would be that if you indicated the number of cases you were looking at or the number of personnel that you had working on your enforcement, that would essentially allow people to hedge their bets and maybe decide not to report a breach that they should be reporting.
So it's a concern that if the number is small, that people might then think, well, I can get away with this and therefore not report.
Yes, so if we indicated what was considered a small number of people deployed or a small number of cases being considered at any one time, exactly that they might decide it's worth sitting on that case rather than reporting it as they should.
So to clarify, is the NCA's concern in your understanding that if they were to report the number of annual cases get passed to law enforcement, that number would be too small to serve as a deterrent?
No, simply that they don't want to set a precedent of being transparent on that matter to the advantage of the adversary, if I can put it that way. And I think we'd feel exactly the same about our data.
I was wondering if there was different standards applied about that level of transparency in different cases, because, for example, the NCA does report the number of suspicious activity reports it receives relating to sanctions. You might consider that might be seen as too big or too small. It's very difficult to understand how to judge this, it seems.
We can't talk for the National Crime Agency. I mean, I would just say with that, there's a difference between what they're receiving in and then what they're doing with that. And from an Ofsted perspective, I would worry, as Chris says, about once you get into saying how many people you've got doing the function, and then the next question is, well, how many people have you got looking after the Russia regime, the Iran regime, the North Korea regime? And then people are like, oh well, that's a regime that's relatively under-resourced, and that might be one where we don't need to be so worried. And you just, our concern is that, well, it's a trade-off between the value of that information being openly available, transparent, public, versus the risks with it. And for us, the sort of trade-off between the potential risks and the benefit of that specific information being out there, as it relates to Ofsted data, we can't speak for National Crime Agency data, doesn't justify getting into the specific details of numbers of people we've got doing what functions and any more specifics than we publish through the annual review process at the moment.
Thank you.
I think there's still areas perhaps of transparency, but I think you're right. Some of this is with the NCA rather than with you, because I think probably more information could be revealed without it damaging their inquiries, but we'll perhaps pursue that elsewhere. But I just wanted to go back to the points that are being raised about this £45,000 worth of fines that you've put in your 2022-23 review. Since then, you have revealed that you've talked about the extra £15,000 of fines, but given the severity of the sanctions on Russia, which is and that they happened the way they happened, would you have expected when all this started that you would have issued more fines?
So I mean, it's difficult. The sanctions have evolved, and we never knew quite how extensive they were going to be at the start. I think we need to. I think the sort of judgment probably needs to be done in a few months, a year or so down the track, given the length of time to the enforcement cases. I will certainly be very disappointed if we come back before you or another committee in a year's time and we've only got this £15,000 fine, because I think we would hope more of the caseload to have emerged and to have become public by then. And it's difficult to put a quantity or a value on a lot of the other action that we've done, be it in the prevention compliance space or be it in the disruption space that we've talked about as well. So, again, I don't think we can consider it entirely in isolation. I think the figure at the moment is lower than we would want, and we hope to have more cases come out that will present a more rounded, fuller picture of our enforcement action.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just come in on that? Thank you, Chair. So obviously we're getting to the point where we understand that you wouldn't say that the whole value of your organisation is based on these small fines or the small number of fines that you've got. What other metrics of success do you use that you can share with us to demonstrate the value of the work that you're doing and the impact that your work with 150 people, some based in my lovely town of Darlington, is having on the, what is a vital strategy for both the previous government and obviously ours?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and we've now got, we've got, of that 150 people we've got in Ofsted, I should just say we've got over 30 now, including Beth in Darlington. It's really thriving community up there. I think, different sets of metrics I'd look at. It's notoriously difficult to measure compliance effectively, and I've yet to see, be it the Financial Conduct Authority or anyone else in this space kind of come up with really good metrics about how you measure compliance. But I think evidence that you would take from banks, from lawyers, from accountants about what they see day to day from Ofsted in terms of the support, the guidance, the engagement activities we do to help them comply. It's a qualitative measure, it's not a quantitative measure, but I would hope that illustrates the work we're doing to improve compliance, which detects, prevents, helps stop bad actors getting into the system, breaching sanctions in the first place. We can give you sort of, more outputs in terms of, the different products that we've done, from frequently asked questions that industry were very keen on and we've now done and have got a really good reaction to help them, guidance that we've produced for many more sectors, all the different fora that we've, and so we can talk a lot about all the products and the help that we give. I think in terms of, where that leads to, a measure of that is going to be that you would see, sort of less need for enforcement action down the line. I don't think we're there yet. We can also point to, it's difficult to point to specifics, but we can talk about, as we said, the disruptions that we can do through feeding into designations that prevent someone getting access to money. We can talk about the licensing framework that we've got that makes sure that we're only letting people access frozen money in tightly prescribed circumstances, and for the right reasons and the right causes, and that where people are not using our licenses in accordance with what they're set out for, that we're able to take action on that. So we can also point to that, and we can talk about, and we've given you some figures, and we published some figures for both the assets frozen in the UK, which is a demonstration of how many assets there are in the UK and how effectively they're being frozen by banks and others, as well as not just the civil monetary penalty cases, but the other work we do with warning letters and so on. So it's a sort of range of factors, a lot more qualitative than quantitative, but we're certainly trying to do our best. But if there are areas where you or others feel more transparency or different things would be helpful, we're very keen to take those on board for future.
Well, that's very helpful. We'll certainly consider that. Dr. Jeevan Sandra MP.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here to board the committee. I would say I spoke to an academic friend of mine a few days ago. He's very glowing about your work, and it's not easy to please academics, so well done on that front. I want to talk about the oil price cap. I think this goes to you, Mr. Watts. Could you say what the role of OFSI is in enforcing that price cap, and also how well you think it's going at the moment?
Sorry, we didn't. Yeah, so enforcement team actually reports to me. So we take as with all of our enforcement, we are taking a proactive approach. We're really looking to support industry with their compliance with the cap, and that's particularly where our focus is at the moment, and also looking to disrupt the circumvention and evasion of the cap as well. So those are our priorities with enforcement at the moment.
And I've seen at least estimates that the revenue that Russia is getting from oil has been rising ever since 23. I think almost no oil at the moment is being sold at $60 a barrel. I think oils is trading $67 a barrel. How do you think Russia is avoiding the price cap at the moment? What's your determination of that?
Yeah, so if I go,
do you want to take things?
Yeah. So I mean, look, I read with a lot of interest the previous evidence that the committee had heard on this from academics and people in the oil and energy industry, and I think a couple of points I'd say. One is the oil price cap was put in place with two objectives. One was to reduce the revenue available to Russia from selling oil, but also to ensure that we didn't overly impact the global oil markets and have a disproportionate effect on energy prices. Both, it still is a very difficult time for UK consumers from energy prices, but that was really difficult period. But also, there are a lot of countries in the world who rely on energy and are very susceptible to energy prices. So, we had to try and balance those two factors. I think we haven't been entirely successful, but we were never going to be, particularly given balancing those two factors. But, we've seen, I think it's over 30% reduction in Russian tax revenue from oil sales since the introduction of the cap. So that's a significant chunk of money that Russia can't use to fund its military operation. We've seen what's called the discount between the Urals price for oil and the Brent price for oil, Urals being basically the stuff that Russia produces, grow from an historic average of $1 or $2 a barrel to between $15 and $30 a barrel.
Just to be clear, I think just perhaps not everyone following the Brent crude price, the standard market price, basically.
Yes. So exactly. So it sort of shows the how much less Russia is getting for its oil versus the market price. So, I think we definitely have had some impact and a noticeable, sizable impact in terms of how Russia's then trying to circumvent that. So that's imposed a lot of costs on them. We estimate they've spent over $10 billion creating what's called the shadow fleet, or the dark fleet, which is oil tankers that have been bought, repurposed, used to transport Russian oil, because Western providers will no longer provide insurance for other tankers to provide that, and they've had to step in and provide their own insurance. That's imposed a significant cost on them, but Foreign Office, and you might have seen yesterday, the Foreign Office announced a major package of further designations against these shadow fleet tankers. So we've gone after those tankers, the shadow fleet, by designating them. Where we designated them, there are really good examples of those ships being put out of action, idling in ports at sea because they can no longer carry out their business. We've actually instigated something that was in the press release yesterday, which is a Department for Transport measure, but an insurance reporting mechanism whereby any tanker going through the English Channel can be challenged by Coast Guard authorities, asked to provide details of their insurance. One of these didn't respond to our requests, and we designated them yesterday. So this is all part of the Prime Minister's call for action on the shadow fleet that was announced at the European political community a few months ago. So there's a lot of action going on, and my final point, if you'll forgive me for rambling on, but particularly on what we do in OFSI, I think the point I would make is that the UK links for a lot of these, the people avoiding, circumventing sanctions and so on, where we tend to feature in the chain is, we've got a large section of the insurance market globally, and it tends to be insurance or to some extent financing. These will be the people who have probably the least visibility of actually the detail of the transaction going on, and generally our impression is making incredible efforts to comply with that. There's been a large element of de-risking from the market, so actually the sort of UK nexus has reduced quite considerably, and and our locus tends to be on those actors who are genuinely trying to comply, and a lot of our government focus now is on the shadow fleet and the people who don't want to comply.
I have one follow-up on that, if I may, Chair. I do want to talk about the insurance side of it, because there's one proposal that, from the moment, one way that Russia avoids these sanctions, or avoids the oil price cap rather, is by basically overpricing ancillary services that ports then don't have an incentive to check around the world, because they just go, yes, that costs X, and that kind of pads up the oil price. There is one proposal here to say that British insurance, or rather more accurately the City of London, could end up telling ports, well, if you don't check this properly, if you don't check the attestation documents, we won't actually provide insurance to you. And I think half of insurance is written to the City of London, 15% of reinsurance maybe. Would you be willing to look at that as another way by which to help enforce the oil price cap?
So the attestation model at the moment already requires, and we have looked to get more granular information of that count. So at the moment, the attestation requirements, you can request itemised ancillary cost already and per voyage attestations. So that was already a measure that we have put in place. So we've already added that. So we've tightened the attestation model to make those requirements already. So somebody at that level can make that requirement and already ask for that breakdown attestation request.
That'd be like, so a foreign port would take the attestation, they could ask the itemised stuff, but they're giving it back to you in one sense, because the problem is that the attestation document will say have a breakdown of costs, but the breakdown of costs wouldn't be correct, and the port elsewhere around the world would have no incentive to do so. The question here is, can we have British insurers say, well, actually, if we're not satisfied that you are providing the proper attestation, then we would ourselves deny you insurance. So it's a market access on our side to help enforce around the world.
We'd certainly be very happy to take that away and have a look, and it's an area where we'd want to engage with the insurance industry here in the UK as to about how feasible an ask that would be of them.
Thank you very much. And I know that Dr. Sanders got other business in the House, so he's not leaving for any other reason than he's being a proper parliamentarian. So thank you very much, Dr. Sanders.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Dame Harriet Baldwin, MP.
Thank you, Chair. And picking up on the point that we were just discussing with the shadow fleet, and our predecessor committee wrote to the Treasury Minister responsible for sanctions in May to say that we'd had evidence that more should be done to tackle the shadow fleet of oil tankers. And I wondered why it's taken 6 months. So can you sort of talk us through what goes on behind the scenes before an announcement like the one we had yesterday, which, of course, I can say, and I hope I speak for the committee, that we welcome. Yeah.
So I can do my best. I mean, I should say the Foreign Office are the people you would really need to speak to, because these were designations developed and made by the Foreign Office. Our role very much comes in explaining what's going on to industry and trying to enforce the OPC as it is. So, but I think,
would you not be doing anything behind the scenes during this period then, this 6-month period?
So, I mean, firstly, with the 6-month period, there's been quite a lot that's gone on more broadly. So I wouldn't characterise it as just the announcement yesterday. I think in October there were a further bunch of ship specifications. I think in July I referred to the European political community where there was the announcement of this call for action against the shadow fleet that the UK spearheaded, has now got, I forget, 40, 50 countries signed up to it, which is exploring a range of mechanisms to try and put pressure on the shadow fleet. And is where this idea I mentioned of the insurance reporting mechanism that the Department for Transport are now doing. It's about, actually the environmental risk from the shadow fleet. They're poorly insured, poorly maintained. Can we do more to be challenging them when they're passing through UK or Danish or European or whatever country it is, territorial waters? We've published, I think it was last week, we published an advisory on the oil price cap, particularly drawing people's attention to what we sometimes see happening, whereby certificates of origin, these are the certificates produced generally by an accredited chamber of commerce in a country that says this oil is from Russia, or it's not from Russia, it's from somewhere else. So we've set out a lot of what we've seen in terms of falsification of these certificates of origin, or obfuscation, where people are trying to hide oil, show it's not Russian. So we set out, a template for how companies, firms might identify that. So that's very much, what we've been doing and our role. We did another one, I think it was pre-May this year, but February we did another one alongside the G7 plus. My team is talking to our G7 counterparts weekly about where we go next as a community on this. And we have had countless meetings internally with the Foreign Office, with the Department for Transport and others, trying to look holistically about the different tools we've got.
So there is a process underway then where you're always urgently looking for ways to close down some of these ways in which sanctions are circumvented, because I think it feels as though you are potentially, and other parts of government potentially, only discovering these things quite slowly, closing down those. Meanwhile, the world learns new ways to circumvent the sanctions. But it sounds as though you are doing sort of proactive work in trying to identify where the next lots of loopholes might arise.
That's definitely the case. I mean, this is an incredibly novel measure, the oil price cap. So to some extent, everyone's in new territory and we can't anticipate everything. But the clear political priorities that the current administration and the previous administration set for us, with the sanctions regime, were drive down Russian revenue and tackle circumvention, evasion, particularly where it relates to export controls, preventing key equipment getting to the battlefield. Those are very much the overwhelming cross-government priorities, and the oil price cap, oil revenues, very much fits into that. So, in terms of what officials are spending the majority of their time within government on, it's very much revenues, oil price cap, other energy measures, alongside the circumvention, evasion piece. This is definitely a top priority.
In the 6 months since we wrote that letter and the announcement yesterday, I mean, I don't even like to think how many people, how many Ukrainians will have been killed during the 6-month period, and I just wondered whether you would feel that there is sufficient urgency in terms of implementing sanctions in your office, but across government.
I mean, it certainly feels urgent and a priority, and we've the impact and the value of what we do has been brought home to us, through what we've seen and heard. So I would say that sense of urgency is definitely there. We are moving and acting as quickly as we can. But some things take time, and this is it's a constant battle.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Chris Coughlin, MP.
Thank you, Chair. So Mr. Thomson, I thought it was very interesting the points you're making around the discount between the international Brent crude oil price and the Russia-Urals oil crude price. Is that real in terms of how much is going on in the black market in terms of that price? Do we know whether that discount is actually real in reality in terms of what Russia's receiving?
So, I mean, I'd have to defer to others within government and provide you more detail on that. I mean, our sense is that it is having a noticeable impact in terms of the actual revenues Russia is able to extract from that oil because of that discount. Quite how that's manifesting itself out, I would have to revert with more evidence on.
And I asked because I thought it was particularly interesting because one of my concerns around sanctions is that they feel good. They make us look like we're doing something, but actually, is there evidence that they are actually having a policy impact on the recipient of those sanctions in line with UK policy objectives? So I thought that maybe in itself was a good example of where potentially it is. Yeah. And have you done analysis of any other instances you can think of where our sanctions have had a policy impact in line with our diplomatic objectives?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. That's a sort of growing field, both within academia and within government, to try and better evidence the impact and the effectiveness of what we do, both to help us target our efforts, but also to sort of demonstrate the value of what we do, as you say. We'd be very happy to provide more information and evidence on that along with the Foreign Office. I mean, just to give you one other example where we've done some work taking the other side of those two priorities I mentioned around reducing Russian revenue and tackling circumvention of export controls. We've done various bits of analysis that show that the cost of components for the Russian military war machine have gone up over 100%. As a direct result of the export controls we've put in place. We could share some more precise figures around specific microchips and other components that are key to battlefield equipment that have gone up over 300% or very large increases. We haven't been able to stop these getting to the Russian military industrial complex completely, but we've imposed significant additional costs on doing so and made it much more expensive. Actions, I'll chuck in another one, actions such as the immobilization of the Central Bank of Russia reserves, that was over $300 billion, immobilized overnight. That is $300 billion of Russian revenue that Putin can't access to spend on the military or to manage foreign exchange risk. The ruble is depreciating rapidly. So, I think that is a really tangible direct result as well.
Yeah, and Jay, I think it'd be great to share that, and that's really good to hear in terms of the impact of our sanctions. And the former Treasury Committee had evidence that the US is apparently doing a better job in going after the enablers of sanctions, such as lawyers and accountants, than the UK. Would you agree with that assessment? Mr. Thomson?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't characterise it as such. I mean, I think that is a big focus for us as well. If you look at the actions that we've done, for instance, the case we've announced recently, ICSL, quite how you define enabler is a bit subjective, but that's a property management firm who are managing a designated person's property, enabling them to extract rent from it and so on, that they shouldn't have been. So that's, I would characterise that as, and we certainly got some other cases that would fall into the enablers bracket. I think we've also designated through the Foreign Office quite a large number of people involved in enabling activity, be it in the UK or in third country jurisdictions. So, I think that's very much a shared priority and a shared objective. And going back to what I said earlier, I think actually typically, where it comes to taking direct action against a designated person, that is by and large going to be in the criminal sphere. And so the National Crime Agency have charged one designated person with sanctions evasion. We're more often than not going to be targeting those bits of the UK system who are either knowingly or through negligence enabling sanctions evasion or breaches to occur.
And Bill Browder, the head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, he suggested, again to a former committee, that sanctions should require accountants, lawyers and trustees who work for sanctions individuals to come forward. I mean, I guess in line with existing anti-money laundering legislation. Is that a realistic proposal? I mean, or is that already covered by I presume that's probably already covered by existing anti-money laundering legislation.
Yeah, so they would very much be required to report suspicious activity reports.
And are you seeing that?
The National Crime Agency would have to speak to what they see from suspicious activity reports. But we're certainly aware of SARs, as they're called, being made in relation to sanctions evasion. They're passed on to us through the National Crime Agency and coming from the accountancy and legal sector. Sorry, Chris. Yeah.
I was simply going to say, sorry, that those people would also need a licence from us in order to provide paid services to those individuals.
Sorry, an accountant.
So if any financial transaction, any economic benefit provided, they would need a licence from us.
Once an individual is sanctioned, a lawyer and accountant can only provide professional services to them if they have a licence. Got you. Okay, that makes sense. And the and similarly, again, we've heard that apparently. According to Transparency International, limited partnerships are the tool of choice for Russian money launderers, there's also concerns around overseas trusts owning properties in the UK. Have you found that these legal entities have enabled sanctions evasion, and what steps are you taking about that?
I would have to defer to the Department for Business and Trade overall on transparency around limited partnerships, because that's their area. From what we've seen, corporate or transparency or lack thereof is undoubtedly a major feature in the work we do on sanctions evasion. It's a common typology that we've published advisories on. Is complex corporate ownership chains using secrecy jurisdictions. I couldn't tell you now that we've seen significant evidence of limited partnerships in our casework, but I would need to check on that to be able to give you a definitive answer.
Thank you very much. Lola McAvoy, MP.
Thank you, Chair. On to cryptocurrency and crypto assets. So I just wondered, Chris Watts specifically, a question for you with your cyber security and your background. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how, if you're detecting the use of crypto assets and how it's affecting your work.
So essentially, I think first things first, the obligations in terms of crypto assets are no different from any other asset. So to provide an economic benefit or to deal with, economically speaking, a designated person, a sanctioned person, has exactly the same controls in relation to crypto assets as to any other form of asset. And so we've tried to improve our capability in terms of understanding transactions through purchase of proprietary systems to assist our intelligence and enforcement teams with tracking those kind of transactions. And we've also worked with partners internationally to try to better understand the picture, but also to give guidance to industry on what they can do. Beth, I don't know, did you want to say anything more on the enforcement front in terms of crypto?
I think you've covered the main points there, that it is exactly as Chris said, it's something, it's the same obligations apply, the same prohibitions apply. And as Chris says, we have invested heavily in our tools at our disposal at the moment and our analytical capabilities, and that's part of what we have utilised some of that Economic Deterrence Initiative funding towards, to supporting our capabilities to address that.
So you've invested in the tech needed, but what's the impact of that so far? Do you feel like you've got, with the investments, have you now got sufficient expertise to be able to try and assess some of the issues facing us with crypto, or are you still at the early stages after that investment?
Certainly true that we're looking at cases involving crypto assets in our intelligence team, with a view to developing those for the enforcement team.
And so would you say that you're detecting greater evasion of sanctions through the usage of crypto or crypto assets, or is it just the same as it always has been, or what's your analysis of it?
I couldn't say that, but we are certainly aware of reporting and of intelligence that's suggesting that there may be a shift to use of crypto assets in order to try and evade sanctions.
There's a moving situation that you're watching, is that in summary? Okay. Thank you. I'll come back to you later, Ms McAvoy. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to transport us to the overseas territories and crown dependencies, figuratively speaking. And I note the joint communique from the Joint Ministerial Council communique from a few days ago, which describes addressing the sanctions vulnerabilities across the overseas territories and improving sanctions cooperation between the UK and overseas territories. And I was wondering, firstly, how do you see your office's role in improving that cooperation? And secondly, what are the major vulnerabilities that you think need to be addressed? To Mr. Thomson to begin with.
Mr. Thomson.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to our work with the overseas territories in relation to sanctions implementation and enforcement, where we do a lot. I mean, the first thing I would say is that they, by and large, operate their own financial sanctions systems, with just Foreign Office oversight to varying degrees depending on the overseas territory. So, we do not have any responsibility or locus, if you like, with the overseas territories. That said, because they're part of the UK family and because of the economic financial links between us, we do spend a lot of time sharing experience, sharing expertise. We had a team recently out in one of the overseas territories helping do that. We spent a lot of time with different overseas territories trying to help them expand their sanctions enforcement and implementation capabilities. We host an annual forum where we get all the overseas territories sanctions experts together with us and other bits of the UK government and system to exchange information and share best practice. So we do a lot of work in that area. We provide what advice we can, but they are autonomous and responsible for their own systems. The obvious point I would make on your second question around sort of impressions of overall effectiveness, they're a very different set of territories. Some are incredibly small where the threat and the risk is very low. Some are larger and some have got business models where there's a much higher risk, and so it very much depends where you're talking about. Very different risks, very different levels of sophistication in response to that.
Yes, and Mr. Thomson, what do you see as the highest risk areas or regions for that, particularly in terms of circumventing UK sanctions?
So, I mean, I think wherever you have a very big financial sector, you are going to have risks. The UK has got substantial risk because we're a global financial centre. So, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, if you look at the facts and figures, along with Bermuda on the insurance side, have got sizable, significant financial sectors, be it company registration in the British Virgin Islands, Cayman is hedge funds and other industries, and insurance in Bermuda. So amongst the OTs, overseas territories, those are the ones that would leap out at you from the figures. I'm not going to be able to give you a sort of an assessment of the effectiveness of their controls, but you can look at, they're all evaluated independently by the regional parts of the Financial Action Task Force who have done recent assessments of the Cayman, British Virgin Islands and Bermuda.
Ms Davies, I was wondering if you had anything to add on the challenges this might pose for enforcement.
Well, we're not responsible for the enforcement within that. But we do. What we have been supporting is as Giles was saying, they're supporting teams in each of the OTs with improving their own capabilities and capacity, and that we have information sharing arrangements. So where there is a case that might touch on, then we have ways of sharing information through appropriate channels. So that's what I'd say to that.
And I'm aware that there's been a timeline for the implementation of public registers of beneficial ownership in those territories. That was meant to be the end of last year. Does this lack of implementation pose any risks from your point of view in terms of enforcement of the UK's sanctions?
So I mean, on the overall question of the implementation of those registers, you'd also have to speak to Stephen Doughty or one of the Foreign Office ministers. Where we would need information on beneficial ownership from the overseas territories, we would be able to request that through the National Crime Agency, who have got access to those registers. I think they're on record as saying that their experience when asking for that information off overseas territories is generally good. Rapid information of good quality is provided. I would have to come back to you in terms of any specific instances where we've requested or got that, but I know that is the overall experience.
Yeah. So the information is definitely there, it's just not public.
I think the debate is around to what extent it should be publicly available or not, but it is available to British law enforcement.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John Glenn MP.
Yes, could I just ask about the alignment with the EU and US? And how you feel about that. Obviously, sanctions regimes are enhanced when they're aligned, but different jurisdictions will have a different take on it occasionally. Could you describe how your work is impeded or how it's affected by misalignment, and what you've done to try and remove some of those disparities, or what the government or governments have done to do that?
Yeah, so I think the biggest impact of misalignment would be on the private sector rather than on us, because they're the ones who have to implement these, and particularly for a lot of large UK firms who operate globally, they will, as you know, they will traditionally want to do US sanctions as well as UK sanctions. So I think there's always a particular problem for them, whereby if we are doing something different to the US but also the EU, and that can be in different ways. So it can be in the designation, where if we all designate different people, for a start, that's not going to be as effective as it could be, because this sort of gives a loophole for the assets to go to, or they get advance warning that the UK might sanction them in the future. So, and we've got a lot better at that over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, and that alignment is much greater. It's never perfect, because there are always particular reasons. We've got different evidentiary thresholds for designations we have to meet. There are different balancing interests that sometimes mean you don't want to proceed with a certain designation. But I think we've got a lot better at that. From our side, prospectively, where it comes to implementation and enforcement, I think the big issues that we hear from the banks are partly around, there's a designation, but then moving on, it's partly around the licenses we put in place, whereby, I mentioned we've tried to get a lot better at being able to put in place the relevant licenses alongside a designation. So a good example of this is what we call wind down licenses, where if you do a major financial sector designation, people need to have time to withdraw business, extract their money. We try and align those with OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, so that if it's 30 days for the US, it's 30 days for the UK. We had instances at the start where we just did 28 days because that was sort of our standard, and just that missed timing makes it a bit of a nightmare if you're trying to extract yourself from these globally. And information sharing is the other area, I'd say, where it's not seen so publicly, but we've come a long way in being able to share information with EU and US counterparts on intelligence enforcement cases as well. I think there's still work we can do. I know the previous committee heard evidence around aggregation, ownership and control as two technical areas that we look at. So I think we're always pushing and challenging ourselves, and industry give us a really good challenge here to go further better.
Obviously, we see a imminent change of presidency in the US, and there's lots of speculations over that, what that would mean. But in terms of the relationship you have with OFAC, your big brother, if you like, how do you see that as evolving, and what assessment have you made, Mr. Thomson, of how they might evolve under a new president?
So, I mean, there's not a lot I can say about what might potentially happen with a new administration, other than, I think the relationship with OFAC it's a long-standing one. I mean, it's improved and it's developed, but it's one we've had. I worked in a version of this role under the previous Trump administration and had very strong relationship with OFAC and with our US counterparts. So I fully expect that to continue. Shared aim, ways of working, objectives. A lot of the improvements we've made to that relationship in recent years, we fully expect to continue. Our secondee will stay out there. They're sending a new secondee who will stay there. Traditionally, you don't see the same turnover of political appointees in OFAC as you do in other areas of the US administration. So, I largely expect quite a lot of continuity in that relationship.
I must say it is reassuring to see you in the same role after I left office 2.5 years ago. But that takes me back to one of my original questions that I meant to ask and didn't ask. Can you just sort of say something about the retention and how of your staff and how long people stay there? And do you have enough people in the right specialist roles? Can you ring fence the specialist roles where you need that expertise? And I think you've taken the lead with some of our work with the Financial Action Task Force representing us internationally and building up those relationships. It would be helpful for us to understand how your team works, given you have some secondees as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a big priority for me across all my teams to try and encourage people to stay longer in roles, to develop those relationships, the experience, the expertise. And, I do think amongst the various jobs I've done in the civil service that this is an area that particularly, there is a premium on that expertise and skills given the complexity and breadth of what we're doing. It's a challenge for us, being honest, the recruitment and retention. Turnover in my bits in Ofsted is not higher than it is elsewhere in the Treasury or government, but that is generally higher than I would personally like in this area. So
you know what it is roughly?
I don't have a precise.
If you're possible to write to us on that, would be helpful.
I'd have to check. Yeah, but so and the Treasury is being as supportive as I think they can be within the overall constraints of public sector pay rules and regulations about how we can incentivise people to stay, be it through investing in training, qualifications that they can get.
That just sounds what seniority. I mean, how what's your pyramid structure?
In the Treasury?
Yeah, in your team.
Okay, so beneath me and within.
So how low do you? I mean, because I know that the high turnover of student staff.
So I'm with you. So we have within Ofsted, Chris and Beth are two deputy directors. SCS1 in civil service speak.
Let's forget that.
Forget that. Deputy directors, and they have each responsibility for a number of units who will be led by a grade 6, who's a sort of upper echelon of what we call delegated grade.
Can you give us a rough pay scale so we can just get in our heads what scale 6 is?
In terms, the grade 6 pay scale
is 60 to 70,000.
Okay, so fairly senior people. Okay,
yeah. They will then manage people down to, our lowest grade is what we call an executive officer, I think, where the pay scale will be much, much lower. I mean, 20 to high 20s, low 20s to high 20s thousand. I would say, I wouldn't say that there's a correlation between grade and turnover necessarily. I think people at more senior grades do tend to stay longer. Chris, we've had the benefit of his experience for some time now, and I'm hoping Beth will similarly stay a long time.
Put you on the spot publicly.
But I think there is undoubtedly this churn and turnover, and some of which is a good thing. It's good to have new skills, new blood, new experience. But we are very keen and working with the Treasury to try and find ways, be it creating professionalisms within government that reward you for staying longer, be it offering further jobs that people can see themselves moving on to within the Treasury, or going on one of our secondments or to the Foreign Office. And a big challenge for everyone working in the financial crime space is, once people go to the private sector, is there a way we can get them back again? But if you have any ideas on that...
Mr. Glenn.
No, I think I've finished. Thank you very much.
Sure. Who's Corbyn MP?
Thank you. So I just on the private sector point, someone who left the private sector to public service, appealing to their vocational instincts helps in my experience. But I'm interested in the unintended consequences of sanctions, and my understanding, for example, on this is that after the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, and disclose I was working in investment management at the time and looking at this, the analysis that I was reading from investment banks in the years after that was that, in fact, the sanctions in some ways helped Russian domestic industry because it made more resilient, so having to develop their own internal supply chains, they couldn't rely on imports so much. Is is that something that you take into account when you're both assessing the impacts of sanctions and thinking about sort of your strategies for where you might put them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a really good point. I mean, well, two answers, if I may. One, in terms of the current Russia sanctions, actually one bit I particularly liked from the previous evidence that the previous committee heard, I think it was from Tom Keating, who made the point that, yes, Russia may have got more domestically resilient in some areas and may have quite high growth, but that's not productive. It's producing 20 armoured vehicles that might get blown up the next week. That's different to producing 20 valuable high-tech goods. So, I think there's definitely an interest. I think we have had real impact in terms of actually, having that economic impact. But we spend a lot of time looking at these sanctions in place of Russia, but also with a mind to the future, working out and talking to our US colleagues for whom this issue is writ large, given the scale of the US dollar in the world economy, about how far through the use of sanctions you encourage ways that will make them less effective in the future, be it the growth of an alternative financial system, alternative to SWIFT, for instance, be it through other global currencies becoming more familiar, be it through the shadow fleet and other insurance. That is a big factor, because there is always a risk that these tools are not as effective next time round, and that is an incredibly difficult balance to strike.
Yeah, exactly.
Very much.
And going more specifically, have you looked at the cost to legitimate businesses from Russian sanctions, and how do you ensure that, say, small UK businesses that don't have compliance departments are complying with sanctions, or they don't find the burden too onerous?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a go at that, but then Chris may want to comment on the licensing side, and Beth more on the enforcement. But I think in terms of what the work we do from a compliance enforcement perspective, we very much try and tailor that to where the biggest risks and the biggest, therefore, responsibilities lie. So we would have less expectation of smaller firms. So we try and produce guidance, but also more perhaps accessible tools like webinars, shorter, more high-level products that they could, a wider range of firms are able to engage in. We rely quite a lot also on our relationships with other supervisors, all the anti-money laundering supervisors who will be more frequent contact with their firms. So, we work quite a lot with the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, for instance, who, will actually engage with smaller law firms and help them. And, in our enforcement cases, we would not generally be looking at the smallest firms unless there are other significant factors at play. I'll perhaps turn to Chris on the licensing side, but actually balancing the impact on legitimate British business is a major plank of the licensing work day in, day out. So, perhaps Chris could say something.
Thank you. So, essentially, in licensing, what we're trying to do is make sure that there are grounds set out in the legislation to allow us to grant a license, a specific license. We can only do that where the grounds exist. Common grounds might be the basic needs of an individual or of a company, or to pay legal fees, or for the holding and maintenance of a physical asset or a corporate asset. So where those exist, we then have a decision to take about whether to use our discretion to grant the license. And I think it's the discretion that is particularly bears upon the point of the nature of the company, perhaps, or the indeed individual who's been caught up in sanctions. And we would tend to be able to take that into account in taking that discretionary decision. So, just for example, not a specific license, but a general license. A few weeks ago, we issued a general license which was aimed at individuals who'd been caught up in making personal remittances, sending money from usually from one country to another for their own personal use or for a dependent's use. And just because those transactions had passed through a sanctioned bank, the money had been frozen. So we issued a general license to allow those sums to be released in the knowledge that those were not people or small companies who would have access to massive legal departments to help them through these cases.
Thank you very much, Mr Coughlin. And over to Lola McAvoy MP.
Thank you, Chair. So last week we heard from the Bank of England Governor, and he was questioned about frozen Russian foreign reserves and the 300 billion figure. He stated that I think his exact words were, we have very little of that in the UK. So I wondered if you could shed some light on, as lots of people have been advocating for seizing some of these frozen reserves, I wondered if you could shed some light on how much you think, given your privileged position, how much do you think of that there is in the UK, and whether it would be achievable to actually seize it.
So of that, the $300 billion figure, I'm not able to give you a precise figure for what is in the UK. That's something we're actually talking with G7 partners about, potentially collectively publishing that data, but until there's been some agreement between G7 partners on when and how we would do that, we've taken the decision not to release the information we do hold. But what I can say is it's a very small percentage, as the Governor suggested, of that 300 billion. The vast majority is held in Euroclear in Belgium. And it's actually, in terms of the second question around the seizure point, the Foreign Office would be able to give you much better evidence on the international legal situation regarding seizure of sovereign assets. What my team is, not OFSI, but the policy team I have responsibility for, have been very actively working on, is the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Scheme, which, as you may be aware, aims that money that is in Euroclear in Brussels, due to the specific nature of Euroclear, how it's held, has been accruing what's described as a windfall or an extraordinary profit. So it's effectively taking that revenue stream and front-loading it so that Ukraine gets money now. And the UK, the bill going through the UK Parliament at present, will give the Treasury the authority to loan Ukraine $3 billion, £2.26 billion over the next 3 years to spend on military equipment to fight the war, and we will get repaid from these extraordinary profits that Euroclear is currently getting. The UK government will get repaid over a longer time period, and the G7 are all doing this collectively. That's very much the focus of the efforts. We continue to look at all options for asset seizure, but there were a lot of difficulties and challenges, and I think the previous committee noted that this is something best done multilaterally, and we would only want to consider doing that alongside other partners.
Okay, yeah. I think that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms McAvoy and Mr Thomson. You were just earlier in your comments, you were talking about whether the services that you rely on others like the Solicitors Regulation Authority to help with small firms. Are you confident that those measures are sufficient, and do you do spot checks to make sure that they're making sure that the compliance is in place?
Yeah. So we don't in OFSI at the moment do spot checks. We have a different role in the respect that we're there to take enforcement action against breaches and to try and prevent breaches occurring. The regulators of the anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing sectors have that broader role of looking at systems and controls, which will include the sanctions screening, and other controls are very much part of your overall financial crime controls. So they will be more likely to be going out doing proactive spot checks, or inspections, and so on. But we will talk very closely with them so that if we see a breach happen, we can report to them, and it may link with work they're doing that have detected faulty systems and controls, or vice versa. But at the moment, that's not something that we proactively do.
Okay, do you think you're missing anything? Are you worried?
I think there would be a real risk of duplication if we started going out and doing that. I think that there's more we could do to perhaps set out our expectations on what appropriate good due diligence looks like. That's something that we continue to look at. Office of Foreign Assets Control in the US publish principles of effectiveness, effective compliance system that industry quite often tell us, oh, that's really useful, something like that. And we've done some of that through our guidance, and we look at that. But at the moment, I think there risks being sort of duplication for not much benefit.
And also there's only 150 of you, so there's a
limit
on resource. You when you mentioned you haven't yet published this year's annual review, when are we expecting that?
So we hope to be able to publish that in the new year. I can't give you a precise...
Yes, new year in civil service terms. That means any time up to the summer, is it?
Call me out. Yeah. I mean, it won't be this side of the Christmas break, but we want to publish it as early as we can in the new year, because we're conscious that normally we publish it around this time. It got paused during the election period.
Course, yes, we appreciate it. It's our fault. We get that point made. And will this include up-to-date comparative figures on seizure of assets and an updated figure on fines that we were discussing earlier?
It would certainly include updated enforcement figures. It would also include updated frozen asset figures. It won't include any seizure figures because, well, we're not currently seizing Russian assets.
Okay, fine. Harriet Baldwin.
Yeah, just very quickly, last question, because we focus so much on Russia today. And perhaps for Mr. Watts, I imagine you're still implementing the sanctions on Libya, Sudan, Syria. Can you just sort of, for the committee's benefit, list all the different countries where we're currently sanctioning people or individuals?
We have 35, I think, different sanctions regimes which we're implementing. Most of those are geographic, but not entirely. So some of them are thematic, like the cyber sanctions regime or the global human rights regime. So historically, a lot of Office's business had been in Libya. So we have about 12 billion of Libyan frozen assets in the UK. So we now have an amount of Russian frozen assets to rival that. And just because of its new nature, Russia has tended to predominate in our licensing and enforcement business over the last 2 years, as you'll know. But we still do a lot of licensing of those other 34 odd regimes, certainly within Office.
But the big ones are Libya and Russia.
Those are definitely the biggest, yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, we had a really interesting session today. I think, as Dame Harriet Baldwin said, we have covered quite a lot about Russia, but there are obviously other areas. And I think the fact that you've tripled in size over the past 2 years has been quite a growth period for you, and the challenge now is to make sure that you're using that resource as effective as possible, and we've obviously delved into some of that today. You've told us that we will see more evidence of Office enforcement activity in the coming months, and we do look forward to that. And while it may be too early to judge whether the amount of fines are right, you did tell us that you will be disappointed if the amount of enforcement isn't higher than the £15,000 this financial year. So we will look forward again to seeing maybe more in your annual report. And we are very clear that we're going to pursue the National Crime Agency about the number of cases that they're investigating, which is currently not disclosed. That's something I think the committee will take up elsewhere. And then the comments and discussions about the designation of Russia's shadow fleet is going to be interesting for us to pursue and watch as well. But I would say that, first of all, thanking our predecessor committee, and Dame Harriet Baldwin in particular, for leading that work, for its previous work on this. It's always a difficulty when an election happens and things stop halfway through, so we're keen to keep an eye on what's going on with you. But we do also note that our sister committee, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, is questioning the Foreign Secretary tomorrow, and given that the Foreign Office is the lead policy department in this area, we expect that a number of the points raised today may be raised with him tomorrow, and between our committees and the Business and Trade Committee, we expect to keep a close eye on what you're doing and what other departments are doing on sanctions. The transcript of this session will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days. Thank you to our colleagues at Hansard for that, and I can thank our witnesses, Giles, Thomson, Beth, Davies and Chris Watts, very much indeed for their time. Order.